Without a doubt, one of Magic's weirdest and most archaic mechanics from the early years has got to be Graveyard Order. This was a mechanic where effects would care about the order that cards entered your graveyard, and as a result, you wouldn't be allowed to change the order of your graveyard at all. This was eventually done away with, but not before we got a few cards that were extremely interesting and powerful with this mechanic. So let's take a look back at one of Magic's weirdest decisions and be thankful we no longer have to deal with this frustrating mechanic. And starting us off at number 10, we have Circling Vultures. This is a 3/2 bird with the mana cost of 1 black. It has flying and the ability where you can discard vultures anytime you would cast an instant, which is a very strange ability, but it makes more sense when you consider its second ability. At the beginning of your upkeep, you either have to sacrifice vultures or exile the top card of your graveyard. This is a pretty appropriate downside for such a broken body. Unfortunately, it does have a few pain points, mainly that you can't actually play it on turn 1 comfortably, as you won't have put any creatures in your graveyard for it to start eating. Still, as early as turn 2 or 3, you can start playing vultures comfortably and getting in at least a few times before it runs out of food. Unfortunately, as strong as this is, vultures just isn't quite worth playing in most formats, in large part thanks to being pretty solidly power crept out of the game. Cards like Delver of Secrets and Dragon Rage Channeler are also 1 mana flyers with 3 power, and they both have downsides that are much easier to manage. All you have to do for Delver or Channeler is reach their condition once. Vultures requires you to constantly put more and more cards in your graveyard to keep it around. This just isn't all that easy to pull off. Still, there are some decks that are capable of sustaining the vultures, and in those decks, the card is quite good. Asmarano, Mardica, Dayston, and Kuldakar commander decks, for example, are built around discarding a ton of creature cards, so they can keep the vulture around easily. Vulture's ability to discard itself also allows you to cast Asmarano without much setup, easily fulfilling its discard condition. Of course, this isn't really worth doing in normal Commander, but in the less popular dual Commander format, just having an efficient attacker is a lot more valuable. This is Vulture's main home, which is unfortunately quite niche. While not a bad card, Vultures is so outclassed that it's hard to blame someone for forgetting that it exists. And at number 9, we have Necratog. This is a 1/2 Tog for 1 and 2 black. It has the ability where you can exile the top creature of your graveyard to give Necratog +2/+2 until end of turn. This is a take on the classic Atog, which has actually had its own time in the limelight in Pauper. Necratog, on the other hand, didn't quite do as much competitively. The main upside of Necratog is that, unlike essentially every other Atog that requires you to sacrifice a permanent for the buff, Necratog only affects cards in your graveyard. This means that when you activate Necratog, you're not really giving up anything. However, this also does have a bit of a downside, namely that it's ever so slightly harder to get creatures in your grave than it is to get them onto the battlefield. All you have to do to get creatures out is cast them, which can be done more easily thanks to the few 0 mana creatures in the game. However, you essentially always have to spend mana to put cards into your graveyard, and milling yourself doesn't inherently do anything helpful. While mechanics like Dredge can let you mill yourself like crazy, they're also quite all in. Milling yourself and casting important cards from your hand at the same time is slightly more difficult than just spamming the board with cheap cards. So the Atogs that sacrifice cards are easier to enable in the early game, if weaker in the late game. The second issue with Necratog is really just the fact that Psychotog makes it look like kind of a joke. While it only gets +1/+1, Psychotog can get the boost by exiling any 2 cards from your graveyard, or by discarding a card. This level of versatility makes Psychotog a menace in the early days of Magic. Psychotog only entered the game around 3 years after Necratog did, so for most of the game's history, if you wanted an effect like this, Psychotog was much stronger. Of course, now both cards have been ridiculously power crept by the incredible Psychic Frog, which draws a card when it hits your opponent, gets a permanent buff when you discard, and can eat cards in the graveyard to gain flying, all for cheaper than either Atog. For a brief window of time, Necratog was a great threat in the late game that could steal matches if not answered, but the game quickly replaced it with superior options that, luckily, didn't care about graveyard order. And at number 8, we have Phyrexian Furnace. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1. It has the abilities where you can tap it to exile the bottom card of target player's graveyard. You can also pay 1 and sacrifice Furnace to exile target card from a graveyard and draw a card. Furnace is a pretty standard piece of graveyard hate, and as graveyard hate is essentially always in high demand, it's seen quite a bit of play. While the tap ability isn't the best form of graveyard disruption around, if you play it out early, it can easily eat up every card that goes into your opponent's graveyard over the course of a game. Even if you do draw it late, the second ability means that it's always a live draw. At the absolute worst, you can just spend 2 mana to exile 1 card from a graveyard and draw a new card. However, the ability to snipe a particular card from a graveyard at instant speed can be surprisingly potent. If your opponent never goes to cast a card like Reanimate, you can simply exile whatever they're targeting before it resolves and stop them from making a potentially game-winning play. Funnily enough, we've actually seen a card that's basically just a fixed version of Furnace printed into the game, Scrabbling Claws. It has the exact same cost and abilities, except it allows your opponent to choose what card to exile instead of always hitting the bottom card of their library. This is technically a downside, as your opponent will always exile the card that they need least from the graveyard. But it's not like Furnace is consistent in terms of exiling problematic cards either. It's basically random, which is only slightly more effective than letting your opponent choose and hoping they mess up. Either way, it's the second ability on both cards that gets the most of their mileage, so the difference is almost completely irrelevant. The bigger issue is just that Furnace has typically been outclassed as a graveyard hate tool by cards like Torment's Crypt that eat the entire graveyard. When you're playing against a graveyard deck, it's typically best to go big or go home. If you really feel the need to snipe particular cards from a graveyard, it's still often better to just play a card like Scavenging Ooze that can more easily be used in the main board. Still, despite not being the best card in its class, Furnace does a good job holding back most graveyard decks, and it is so powerful against targeted reanimation spells that it at least has a niche, even if there are generally stronger options. And at number 7, we have Death Spark. This is an instant for 1 red. It has the effect to deal 1 damage to any target. It also has the ability where, during your upkeep, if it's in your graveyard with a creature card directly above it, you can pay 1 to return Death Spark to your hand. This is quite the strange card. While 1 damage for 1 mana isn't a good rate, being able to use the card multiple times is quite an attractive prospect. Cards like Punishing Fire have been banned in the past thanks to being burn spells that you can repeatedly return to your hand. Of course, Death Spark's condition is far more specific than Punishing Fire's is. It's very easy to end up in a situation where your Death Spark is under the wrong type of card and never be able to get it back again. And if that happens, Death Spark is just a bad card. Now, there are a few ways to make a Death Spark better. If a creature you control is about to die, you can fire off a Death Spark in response. This will make it go to your graveyard before the creature, so it will end up on top of Spark and allow you to pop it back to your hand. This is even easier with creatures with sacrifice abilities. Anytime you find yourself in a spot where you want to use one of these sacrifice abilities, you can cast Spark first to get some extra damage and just get it back next turn. These qualities have allowed Spark to see a small amount of play in Pauper Goblins. This deck will not only have a lot of creatures dying here and there, giving you opportunities to set up your Spark, but it also has cards like Mog Fanatic that have powerful sacrifice abilities. The deck was set up to take advantage of Spark with frightening consistency, which was great, but unfortunately, Spark is still just a bit too finicky to be a staple. Fundamentally, Spark is just not going to be popping back into your hand every turn, which it really needs to be doing to keep up with the rapid power creep of the game, even in Pauper. Spark's not a bad card by any means, but the amount of work it asks to make work has often not been worth it. And at number 6, we have Ashen Ghoul. This is a 3/1 zombie with a mana cost of 3 and 1 black. It has haste, letting it attack right away, and the ability where you can pay 1 black to return it from graveyard to the battlefield. But you can only do this if there are 3 or more creature cards above it in your graveyard, and only during your upkeep. Ashen Ghoul's ability to continually come back from your graveyard can be incredibly strong, as long as you're able to keep putting more and more creatures into your graveyard. While not all that difficult to pull off, once you reanimate an Ashen Ghoul and it dies once again, you will have to find a way to put another 3 creatures into your graveyard before you can use its ability again, as it will then be the top card of your graveyard. This does make Ghoul a bit harder to use in the average deck, but it's amazing in all-in graveyard-focused decks, such as Dredge for example. Ashen Ghoul is a perfect fit for these decks, working well with what they excel at and not being affected by the strategy's few downsides. It doesn't require you to draw Ghoul for it to be online at any point, So the fact that dredge decks will never actually be drawing for turn is irrelevant. It's also a card that loves it when you just mill yourself as much as possible, which is the main upside of dredge as a strategy. This allowed Ashen Ghoul to slot into a ton of dredge aggro decks throughout the years, though it has, over time, slowly fallen out of favor. Cards like a Corrid were generally more effective as threats in the deck, and while you could just play them both, the deck quickly filled up more powerful cards to play, which phased Ghoul out of builds in favor of new additions. And at number 5, we have Krovikan Horror. This is a 2/2 horror spirit with a mana cost of 3 and 1 black. It is the abilities where, at the beginning of each end step, if it's in your graveyard with a creature above it, you can return it to your hand. It also lets you pay 1 and sacrifice a creature to deal 1 damage to any target. While Horror doesn't have a good body for its cost, both of its abilities are really strong. Once you do have Horror on field, the ability to throw your other creatures around makes combat a headache for your opponent, though you're not likely to commit to casting it thanks to how bad its stats are. Luckily, you can easily get away with never even casting Horror thanks to how good its ability to recur itself is. Unlike Deathspark, Horror's ability to bounce into your hand works at the beginning of any end step, and it doesn't require mana to use. This means that it's a lot more worth jumping through hoops to try and abuse. One really simple way to make use of Horror's unique ability is with the card Zombie Infestation. This is a 2-mana enchantment that allows you to discard 2 cards to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. By discarding Horror and another creature to this ability, you can stack them in your graveyard however you want, putting the Horror under the creature to get it back at the end of the turn. Now, this does mean you go down a card in the exchange overall, but even that can be mitigated with a card like Squee, Goblin Nabob, that pops back to your hand during your upkeep. This basically lets you get a free 2/2 every single turn with these 3 cards. While it can be hard to get this exact setup going, if you play a ton of cards with these types of synergies, you'll always have something strong to do. This is most pronounced in Bazaar decks in Vintage, built around the card Bazaar of Baghdad, which allows you to tap it to draw 2 cards, then discard 3. This really incentivizes using cards like Horror and Squee to offset the downside of discarding. Now, it has been outpaced by cards like Master of Death that can do what it does, but better. While now outdated, Horror once was a staple in a very powerful style of deck, and that can't be ignored. And at number 4, we have Spinning Darkness. This is an instant with a mana cost of 4 and 2 black. It is the ability where, rather than pay this spell's mana cost, you can exile the top 3 black cards of your graveyard. It has the effect to deal 3 damage to target non-black creature, and then you gain 3 life. Darkness is essentially just a solid removal spell that you can cast a weird way. Actually spending 6 mana to spin the Darkness is pretty awful, so you have to rely on the free cast condition. This can be a bit difficult to do, but the decks that play Spinning Darkness are capable of putting enough black cards into the grave to cast Darkness consistently. The main home for Darkness in the modern day is a pauper deck called Golgari Garden. This is a deck that uses Kalani Garden, a land that makes a token when it enters, alongside a ton of black cards like Deadly Dispute to generate card advantage. They then play a bit of control game with spells like Snuff Out to grind their opponent out. Of course, this strategy will require you to take a bit of punishment from your opponent in the early turns of the game, not to mention paying life to your Snuff Outs. This means that Darkness's life gain is even more valuable for the deck. Their graveyard will essentially always be full of disputes to exile, so you also never have to worry about being able to cast Darkness. Now, despite being a bit of a staple in Golgari Garden, it's only a one-off in most lists, as you don't want to draw too many of them and have them stranded in your hand. While a bit of a niche card, it's extremely powerful in terms of what it does. And at number 3, we have Nether Shadow. This is a 1/1 spirit with a mana cost of 2 black. It has haste and the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, if it's in your graveyard with at least 3 creature cards above it, you put it onto the battlefield. This is basically the prototype for Ashen Ghoul, and overall the far more successful card. The main upside of Shadow is that you just don't have to pay any mana to use it. Every single turn, if you've milled yourself enough, you'll just get a bunch of free attackers if you're playing Nether Shadow. Of course, these bodies aren't all that big, so the damage may seem negligible. However, since you're not using any mana to get out shadows, you can spend your turn casting spells or using cards that make your shadows way more dangerous. If you're playing cards like Narcomoeba, you can sacrifice either to a card like Dread Returned to bring any creature out of your graveyard. The most common targets has to be Flamekin Zealot, which would pump your entire board and give them haste for the rest of the turn. This can let you attack for truly ludicrous amounts of damage as soon as your second turn, with a crazy enough hand. These free bodies can easily be sacrificed to something like Cabal Therapy to interact with your opponent, and at times stop them from playing at all by ripping their hand apart. All of this is enabled by the fact that Nether Shadow doesn't actually have any cost associated with it. Asking for even 1 mana would mean that a lot of decks wouldn't be interested in the card anymore. But the sheer efficiency of getting a free 1/1 creature, potentially indefinitely, is extremely exploitable. Over time, the card has been dropped in favor of other options, cards like Poxwalkers for instance, making this an incredibly competitive spot. But for a long time in Magic's history, Shadow has had an impressive amount of relevance. And at number 2, we have Volrath's Shapeshifter. This is a 0/1 Shapeshifter with a mana cost of 1 and 2 blue. It is the ability where you can pay 2 to discard a card. It also has the ability where, while the top card of your graveyard is a creature, Shapeshifter has the text of that creature, except it also has the ability to pay 2 to discard. Stealing the full text of a card is essentially just copying it with extra steps. But those extra steps are really important within Magic's rules. Either way, Shapeshifter is a versatile combo piece that can do some straight up unfair things with the right setup. One of the most common combos involves abusing Phyrexian Devourer's abilities. This is a creature that allows you to exile the top card of your library to put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is its mana value. However, if its power is ever 7 or more, you have to sacrifice the Devourer. The thing is, because Shapeshifter can change what it's copying at instant speed, we can activate Devour enough times to exile our entire library. Then exile the Devourer from our graveyard with a card like Necratog so that it's no longer a copy of Devour. All of the Devourer's activations will still resolve and give us all the counters, but we won't have Devourer's downside anymore because we aren't a copy of it. We can then just eat cards out of our yard with Necratog until a creature like Triskelion is the top card of our graveyard, and just kill our opponent by removing the +1/+1 counters from our Shapeshifter. This combo is not only powerful, but very hard to stop. If your opponent is packing removal like Naturalize to try and destroy your Shapeshifter while it's an artifact, you can just activate it in response and then eat cards out of your graveyard so that it's no longer a copy of Devourer, and the spell will fizzle. This is just one combo with Volrath Shapeshifter. There are way more, and they're all immensely frustrating and powerful. Despite being a 1-card combo machine, there's still one graveyard order card that's even better. And all the way at number 1, we have Shallow Grave. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It is the ability where you return the topmost creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, and you exile it at the beginning of the next end step. There's really not much to be said for Shallow Grave. It's just a 2-mana reanimation spell with a very small downside. While it doesn't give you the card forever, often 1 turn is more than enough to win with a card like Grizzlebrand or Atraxa Praetor's Voice in play. Not having control of what you bring back also doesn't really matter in the type of deck Shallow Grave sees play in. In Reanimator decks, you would normally just try to use a card like Entomb or possibly Buried Alive to put huge creatures in the bin and then bring them back immediately, making a ton of value and putting you in a dominating position. Because you plan to purposefully bin a huge creature, you can easily make it so that the top card of your graveyard is exactly the card you want to reanimate. The only real thing keeping Shallow Grave out of Reanimator decks would be its competition, and there are other good reanimation spells. Reanimate and Animate Dead both reanimate creatures for the same amount of mana or less, but they don't get rid of it. So most of the time, players have opted for one of these 2 cards. However, sometimes Shallow Grave has been used over Animate Dead simply because Animate Dead is an enchantment. If Animate Dead leaves the field, you have to sacrifice whatever you brought back, while Shallow Grave will always let the creature stick around for the rest of the turn. So in very niche situations, Shallow Grave can be better. Still, Animate Dead letting you keep the creature is generally so much stronger, players have opted for it far more often. Before we leave, we should also talk about Corpse Dance, an instant speed version of Shallow Grave for 3 mana. It also has the buyback mechanic for 2 mana, meaning if you pay the extra 2 mana for it, it pops back into your hand after it resolves. This means you can repeatedly reanimate a creature every turn for a total of 5 mana. Even better, because the card doesn't exile the card if it dies some other way, you can sacrifice the creature you dance back to put it back in your graveyard, and then just reanimate it again. This was actually the basis for a deck way back in the day, where they would repeatedly reanimate Bottle Gnomes to sacrifice it to gain 3 life and block a creature until you find a win condition. I swear this was a real viable strategy at one point in Magic. Anyway, Shallow Grave and Corpse Dance are actually some of the better reanimation spells in Magic, despite the fact that a lot of players will forget that they even exist.